All right, we're entering slightly darker territory here. The invasion of the Soviet Union by the German army along with its allies on the 22nd of June 1941 was really one of the most colossal events in human history. Colossal in human terms, I suppose in the end, eventually in political and strategic terms as well. But it wasn't an accident that it turned out the way it was. There is a slightly dynamic relationship between German intentions and the course of the war on the battlefield, which is to say, it's not as if the Germans had planned in advance exactly what was to be done with the so-called Jewish problem in Europe before the campaign. In some ways, they were kind of symbiotic. They came together. They came together literally because, of course, the Soviet Union to Hitler represented sort of the Jewish question writ large, or as he liked to call it, the Jewish bacillus, or sort of like disease strain. Communism, if you remember, was seen as a Jewish phenomenon by the Nazis. Curiously enough, so was capitalism. They were both seen as Jewish. You remember you had the Red International and the Gold International. However, Hitler really hated the communist version. I mean, his real vision was partly about, again, Lebensraum and living space in the East, but it was mostly to do with the fact that although the Jews he saw as, of course, the ultimate racial enemy, only second to the Jews were the Slavs. The Slavs were, in fact, a different category of, as the Nazis called them, Untermenschen. You know, essentially, I mean, literally means under people. People who, that is, are of a lower racial level. Now, as Hitler put it in an interesting kind of vision of what he wanted, shall we say, the post-war world to look like. Looking east, you can see on your maps, you know, just how far east the Germans made it. They didn't make it as far as they wanted, but they made it pretty far east. You know, they made it all the way to the Caucasus and Stalingrad. There's a story where de Gaulle, supposedly visiting Stalingrad after the Second World War, you know, turned to his companion and said, "My word, what a great people." And his companion said, "Oh, you mean the Russians?" And he said, "No, I mean the Germans." That is, how did they make it that far? It was an impressive display of military prowess. In human terms, however, it was horrifying. Anyway, here's how Hitler described it in as, shall we say, euphemistic a style as you can imagine. A kind of social engineering plan for Lebensraum on the Eastern Front. Quote, "The area must lose the character of the Asiatic steppe. It must be Europeanized. The Reich peasant, that is the Germans, is to live in outstandingly beautiful settlements. The German agencies and authorities are to have wonderful buildings, the governor's palaces. Around each city, a ring of lovely villages will be placed to within 30 or 40 kilometers. That's why we are now building the large traffic arteries on the southern tip of the Crimea to the Caucasus Mountains. Around these traffic strands, the German cities will be placed like pearls on a string, and around the cities the German settlements will lie. For we will not open up Lebensraum for ourselves by entering the old God-forsaken Russian holes. The German settlements must be on an altogether higher level." Well, that's interesting, but the problem, of course, with creating a greater Germany here is that there were a lot of people already living there, you see? And you had to get rid of them. As it was put by Himmler, head of the SS, even before the campaign began, the basic goal was, quote, to decimate the Slavic population by 30 million. Remove 30 million people, replace them with Germans. That was the goal. This was not a conventional war. Now, it's curious that in part because of Hitler's, again, his racial theories, his racial ideology, the war in the West actually was different. It's not that the Germans were particularly nice in France, but they weren't beasts. Now, as Hitler even told his generals, look, we will more or less obey the laws of war in the West. You know, we'll have treaties, we'll have truces, we'll treat the prisoners of war. You know, we're not going to give them, like, paradises and DVD players. Of course, they didn't have DVD players then. But, you know, we'll give them enough to eat, basically. We'll treat them according to our understanding of the laws of war, the Geneva Convention, and so on. The war in the East was never to be like that. It was a war of extermination from the start. They passed the so-called Commissar Order. This is even before, again, the war begins. June of 1941. The Commissar Order stipulated, and I quote, that any commissars or functionaries of the Soviet government are in principle to be disposed of by gunshot immediately. No discussion, no trial, just shot. Meanwhile, the army, along with its various branches, including the famous Einsatzgruppen created, which were sort of like extermination squads, they were ordered, quote, to take out ruthless and energetic measures against Bolshevistic agitators, guerrillas, saboteurs, Jews, and total elimination of all active and passive resistance. At the Nuremberg trials, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders admitted that his unit, just a small unit inside what was really only a kind of sub-unit of the German war machine, the Wehrmacht, he said that his men murdered about 90,000 people in 1941 alone. The Germans, in the course of the early days of the campaign, just between June and December of 1941, they shot, I think I wrote it up here, they shot about 500,000 Jews. In addition to, of course, members of the Soviet government, functionaries, etc., who were seen as either Jewish or crypto-Jewish or, at the best, Slavs who were sort of subhuman anyway, and thus to be disposed of by gunshot. It's a curious way to begin a war against a country where, in fact, many of the people welcomed the Germans as liberators. One of the really bizarre aspects of this campaign is that when they heard the German army was coming, many people actually cheered and celebrated. After all, they had been living under communism for 20 years. They had seen friends, neighbors, members of their family, carted off in these meat wagons, deported by Stalin to the interior reaches of Siberia. Many of them, of course, just executed without hand. Many of them in camps and gulag camps. Stalin was a mass murderer. He was despised in his country. Many of these people, particularly in areas of the Baltic states, which recently had just been carved up, remember, by Stalin, they welcomed the Germans in. Now, this was one of those areas of course, great controversy later. Did you collaborate with the Germans? Stalin later famously, of course, held entire categories of people guilty of collaborating with the Germans, including many Muslim groups, such as famously the Tatars of the Crimea, in part because, yes, many of them had collaborated with the Germans. They had because they thought the Germans were coming to free them from Stalin. But, of course, the German orders were not to liberate these people, but essentially to enslave them. And many of them, instead of being enslaved, were simply supposed to be shot. Now, it's not clear that the Germans yet knew exactly how this whole campaign would look. That is, the campaign of racial extermination. We know that there was a conversation back in April. Hitler talked to one of his key advisors, Alfred Rosenberg. There's no transcript. But we know that Rosenberg wrote in his diary that Hitler had discussed plans with him, quote, which I do not want to write down, but will never forget. These plans may just have been about the shooting of the Jews in 1941. They probably didn't relate to the future plans, the death camps that eventually determined. But it was clear that they were beginning to think about what they were going to do. Finally, that they had now all of these Jews in their grasp. Now, it wasn't just the kind of racial theory of Slavs and Jews as subhumans that mattered. It was also the geography of Europe. Just to give you an idea of where most of the Jews were located, a couple of figures. Yes, there are Jews in places like France and Spain, Central Europe, and Italy. Italy has about, at this time, less than 10,000, at least in the northern areas the Germans controlled. France has a little under 100,000 Jews. The Netherlands, the Dutch, they've got another maybe 100,000. Significant numbers, but not enormous. Poland has almost 3 million Jews. Russia, although many had already left or emigrated, Russia still had close to 1 million. Romania had close to 1 million. Hungary had 400,000. So Eastern Europe, this essentially is where the killing fields are located. This is where most of the Jews are. This is where also Slavic populations are. Slavs like the Serbs, who one of the reasons they were so nasty in the 1990s is because they were, of course, grossly mistreated in the Second World War. They like to blame the Muslims, although they were also grossly mistreated by the Croats, and by basically agents of Hitler and the Nazis. So this becomes essentially a vast killing ground under Nazi control. Now again, the original plans may not necessarily have involved the colossal death camps they eventually built. Presumably, had the Nazis won the war with the Soviet Union more quickly, they might have carried out other measures. They might have kept shooting Jews randomly. They might have sent some of them to Palestine. They actually did discuss that, forced emigration, telling the Jews to leave, presumably after robbing them of everything they had and so on. There were other plans they were discussing. The problem for the Germans, though, was that the war against the Soviet Union did not go well. Initially it did, yes. One kind of interesting measure of morale inside the Red Army is that in the course of 1941, which is not a year, it's like half a year, like 5 months, the Germans captured 3.5 million prisoners. By the end of the war, the Germans had captured over 8 million Soviet prisoners of war. In fact, of these, it's interesting to note that 1 million Soviet prisoners of war volunteered to fight in the German army. They were called Osttruppen, essentially troops of the East. It's true the Germans didn't totally trust them. They mostly assigned them to occupation duty in places like France and Italy where they, wouldn't be able to desert. That's how much anti-communist, anti-Stalinist settlement there was. Even though the Nazis are coming and waging a war of annihilation, 1 million Russians go to serve the German army. So yes, morale is bad. It nearly cracks. Stalin famously gives way under the strain. The strangest part about this whole invasion from the Russian side is that everyone in the world had told Stalin it was coming. His own advisors. Spies from the Western countries, British liaisons, American liaisons. The Germans, they invaded Russia with 3 million troops. Not just Germans. They had volunteers from Romania, Finland, France, Hungary, Slovakia, Spain, all of them itching to, shall we say, settle scores with the communists. They had volunteers coming in out of the woodworks. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen were not exclusively German. They had many volunteers from these countries. So they have this massive army, roughly 150 divisions. By comparison, the famous campaign of Erwin Rommel in North Africa, the Libyan campaign. Actually, one of Libya's principal industries after the Second World War was actually selling off spare metal from all the tanks that were in the desert from those campaigns. Rommel, I wrote this up here. They sent Rommel eventually to Libya. He had 2 divisions. Now, his 2 divisions were well equipped, admittedly, so maybe it wasn't quite the same as far as the size per division. But that said, they sent 150 divisions into Russia. They sent 2 divisions to Libya, which very nearly made it to Cairo, which is one of the reasons people think had the Germans just focused in the Middle Eastern campaign, they could have won the war. But Hitler, of course, was focused on that campaign because that to him was the whole point of the war, was basically decimating the Slav and Jewish populations. This, just briefly, I'm going to talk about the Mediterranean theater because it does have a certain impact on the fortunes of the Germans in the war. What had happened the previous fall, you remember I mentioned that Franco had not allowed the Germans to send troops to Gibraltar. A couple of other things happened that winter and then the spring. The main of which was that in October, Mussolini and the Italians had tried to invade Greece. If you've seen that movie, rather purplish, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, they have a lot of fun with this. Italy spends months trying desperately to win like a meter of territory in Greece, and they fail. And then the Germans send troops, and Greece surrenders before they even arrive. It was like that extreme. The Italians spent months, they did nothing. When the Germans arrived, the Greeks surrendered practically without firing a shot. So what basically happened is that because Mussolini heated up the campaign in the Mediterranean, first by invading Greece by way of Albania, and then essentially there was already a border war with the British between Italian Libya and British Egypt. The Libyans started losing and the British started pushing into Libya. So Hitler sent Rommel and these two divisions to Libya. They very rapidly had rolled up the British in Libya. They pushed into Egypt. Meanwhile, the Germans take about 5 weeks to conquer Yugoslavia and Greece. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary how efficient the Germans were. They also took Crete, the island, in basically just a couple of weeks with paratroopers. The British, this is probably their most single ignominious defeat of the war. It was just humiliating. They were ejected from this country, by essentially like a couple, not a couple dozen, but seemingly a few hundred German paratroopers. So yes, the Germans roll up everything in southeastern Europe. They more or less conquer parts of Egypt, but this causes a delay. A delay of, depending on how you count it, about 6 weeks. That is in preparing for the invasion of Russia. They had to make sure they had this whole flank secure. They also had to, of course, transfer troops along with tanks, munitions, fuel to prepare the invasion of Russia. That 6 weeks might have made a difference. That's one of those other what-ifs of the war military historians like to talk about. I think in the end it probably wouldn't have led the Germans to win. That said, the Germans would have been in a stronger position in December, which is when the main counterattack happened. Now Stalin, it wasn't just that he wasn't expecting the attack, he disregarded it. For the first 2 weeks, he actually didn't even appear in public. When he finally gave an address on the radio, for the first time, abandoning the kind of stilted communist language and talking about Russians, and rallying people behind what they would eventually call, I should have written this down, the Great Patriotic War. Even to the extent where Stalin eventually allowed the church to recover some of its lost position, so that Russians, because many of them were believers, eventually he abandoned some of the worst excesses of at least communist doctrinal propaganda. In terms of his policies, he was no less cruel. But in terms of propaganda, they did begin to bring back patriotic themes. And yes, the main thing basically was that Stalin didn't leave Moscow. They evacuated, the government archives and all of this, but they did all of that in secret. They didn't let the people know they were evacuating the government and its archives. They also even moved like factories, industrial equipment, plants to the Ural Mountains. But Stalin stayed in Moscow, which rallied the public so that they thought that after all, if Stalin is still here, things are safe, because Stalin was obviously the dictator of the country. They did, they retreated, they lost almost their whole air force the very first day. They lost huge gobs of prisoners. The Germans, as you can see on this map, although this was actually 1942. They didn't make it quite this far in 1941. But still, you can see how close to Moscow they got. They got within sight of Moscow. They could see the city skylines. When suddenly this ferocious and surprising Russian counterattack commenced. Made possible in part, if you remember, because the lack of coordination between Germany and Japan and Stalin's intelligence on Japan allowed him to transfer 20 divisions in from Siberia, which the Germans weren't expecting. Also because the Russians had kept a lot of their forces in reserve. The Germans, by this point, had kind of, in the usual way of modern war, they'd sort of outrun their supply lines. Hitler famously had not, of course, given enough winter clothing and boots to his men, such that when the winter came and the first snows came, they really were not prepared. Many of them died of frostbite. Even worse than this, though, the initial successes of the campaign caused Hitler to become complacent. He actually ordered German factories to slow down the production of tanks, which was the key weapon on the Eastern Front, as you can imagine. Huge open spaces, a lot of territory. The Germans really were underpowered. They really did not have a lot of wheeled motor vehicles or tanks. The so-called blitzkrieg, turned into more or less a kind of horse wagon-drawn flog in the mud. The so-called Rasputitsa, which hits Russia every fall and spring. Basically, the rains come, everything turns to mud. They didn't have enough tanks. They didn't have enough equipment. In the end, the Germans were woefully under-equipped for the Russian winter. And then this ferocious counterattack came literally 2 days after Pearl Harbor. So in the course of like a week in December 1941, you have the German army being forced to retreat from Moscow under a furious counteroffensive of the Russians, which, had Hitler really been paying attention, would have realized meant that the whole campaign in Russia was now pretty much lost. Not that they couldn't win territory, but there's no way they're going to defeat the Russians. If they can't even take Moscow in the first year. They were expecting to take Moscow in 6 weeks. Now, some of that is also because they diverted too many forces. They also tried to take Leningrad to the north, Old Petersburg, and then, of course, the Caucasus. So they divided their army in 3. In fact, the offensive on Moscow was further delayed by 2 months because Hitler wanted to take the Caucasus so he could have Baku and its oil. In the end, he tried to do 3 things at once and accomplished none of the 3. Although Leningrad, of course, will be surrounded, and famously, this leads to the 900-day siege. 900 days, where the city virtually starved to death. Horrible stories of the kind of things people are eating, cannibalism and all of that horrendous stuff. Supposedly there was like a small area that was open to the north, to Finland, which allowed a few people to survive. But for the most part, the city starved. That said, the Germans took neither Leningrad nor Moscow, nor did they make it to the Caucasus. The war bogs down first in the mud, then the snows. Then the Russians counterattack. The Germans reel, and eventually they lose in the course of the winter from losses on the battlefield, from frostbite. They lose almost a third of their army. Its fighting elan kind of never quite recovers. That, along with America's entry into the war, Hitler maybe on some subconscious level now perceived that things were not going well. At the very least, he knew that the war would not end soon. It had turned into, worst of all nightmares, another war of attrition. He did not want to fight the First World War over again. The whole idea of the Blitzkrieg was to do these kind of like short, lightning-sharp battles that would be over quickly. Because he knew that Germany could not stand a long war if Britain controlled the oceans and all of the rest of it. Yes, it was better if you had Russian grain and oil, but even so, he did not want a long, drawn-out war of attrition, and now he had one. In fact, Hitler, another one of those what-ifs of the war, Hitler really did not even fully mobilize the German war economy until almost 1944. Nazi race theory also applied to women. The Nazis basically believed in division of the sexes. Women were obviously supposed to bear children for warriors, so he didn't allow them to work in the factories. He didn't allow that until very late in the war, and even then they still highly discouraged it. So the German economy was not really even functioning at full capacity. He had not fully, they weren't rationing even. He did not want the Germans to tire of the war. He didn't trust them in a way. Remember, he was actually Austrian, he wasn't German. So, all of this comes together now. The bogging down of the war on the Eastern Front, America's entry into the war, it's turning into a long, drawn-out war of attrition. This together with some of the experiments that they have already put into place regarding, shall we say, just the kind of ceremonial shooting or unceremonial shooting of Jews and commissars. They now get together for the first serious discussion of what they are going to do about the so-called Jewish problem. Now, they had a phrase for this. This was back in July, the end of July. Goering had talked to Heydrich. They began using this phrase, the Gesamtlösung or Endlösung of the Jewish problem as they saw it. We usually translate one or both of these phrases into English as final solution. Final being the key word in a way, finality basically meaning it will be ended, of course, by mass murder. The Holocaust, of course, that's the more umbrella phrase we use to describe the whole phenomenon. But final solution, in a way, that's sort of the German euphemism for the policy. That's what they were discussing, how to, quote, solve the Jewish problem as they saw it. So this leads to the famous Wannsee Conference. Now, it's curious that a couple things about the Wannsee Conference. Although it's true that they kind of spoke in euphemism and they weren't explicit about what they meant, it was pretty clear what they meant, because they're talking about things like organizing trains, organizing factories, talking about more efficient ways of killing people. It's all pretty explicit. And it's actually all online. You can look this stuff up if you know German. You can also visit it. the actual place where they got together and plotted to destroy European Jewry, it's right there on the Wannsee in modern Berlin. They host conferences there from time to time. And you can actually look and sit in the same room that they planned this. So what did they plan? What were they discussing? Well, okay, a couple of problems. One, shooting is expensive. It's also it's not that easy to get people to do it in a way. It's not that you can't get people to fight a war, but to line up thousands of people one after another next to essentially like a great big pit and shoot them in the back of the head and kick their lifeless bodies into the pit. It's not for everyone. There are some people who revel in doing that sort of thing. Even they might get tired eventually. Some of their units, and it's interesting because the kind of question about, again, war guilt, collective guilt, the Germans didn't always even trust fellow Germans. They often had, some of these other volunteers from places like Romania, Finland, France, etc., do this sort of thing. Not so many from France, more from Eastern Europe. Not all Germans would do it. In fact, there's some interesting books that actually look at this specific phenomenon, like what happened in individual, Einsatzgruppen or police battalions. And there would usually be a percentage of men who would refuse to do it. Even though they were Germans and they had been bombarded with racist propaganda about the Jews, they still wouldn't do it. So there were hesitations. Also, primarily, it was expensive. So how do you kill people more efficiently? Right. You put them together eventually in kind of killing centers. How do you kill them, though? They tried cyanide, they tried various poisons. What's that? Yeah, Cyclone B eventually was the gas that they used. It was developed by a pesticide company. Pesticides, what you use to, get rid of like vermin and insects who were munching on your garden, that sort of thing. They experimented with different types of gases, basically. Cyclone B turned out to be the most efficient and the most, of course, cost efficient. They put through a bunch of orders. It was developed by this notorious company, which originally actually had a lot of Jewish directors. They were purged from the company, of course. It was IG Farben. Now, meanwhile, the gas chambers they used were developed by another company called Topton Company of Erfurt. And they actually had competitive bidding. They talked about things like, we want gas-proof doors so the gas doesn't escape. They needed a way of getting the gas in inconspicuously so people wouldn't realize it was coming. So they decided it would come in through the ceiling, so that it would look like it was like a shower or something. And that's what they told the people. We need to delouse you and clean you off. They told them they were going in to have a shower. So they took a bunch of competitive bids on different types of gases. And also, the best ways of processing the units. They had competitive bids taking on, quote, a processing unit able to dispose of 2,000 bodies every 12 hours. And eventually, they perfected the system. They started killing at a place called Belzec in March. At Belzec, the rate was about 15,000 a day. But they decided, that wasn't fast enough, and so they built faster and larger processing centers. The names, which now ring with a kind of sense of catalytic genocidal doom, Treblinka, Sobibor, and of course famously Auschwitz, most of these places in Poland. It's an unpleasant subject, but I do think because it's incredibly vivid, you should have an idea of what it actually was like when this happened. Because after all, in some ways it doesn't even make sense. Why would these people even agree to submit? Why wouldn't they fight back? Why wouldn't they resist? They did at times. There was an uprising in Warsaw, of course, by the Jews, which is actually dramatized in that movie Schindler's List, from I think like 1993. There were a few isolated episodes of that. But for the most part, what happened, by the time people were executed, they had already been stripped of all human dignity. They were actually worked for a time. Auschwitz actually doubled as a kind of chemical and rubber plant. So they would work them while they still had energy. They literally plotted the kind of time scale over which they would be gradually weakened by malnutrition because they didn't want to waste food on them more than they had to. So that by a certain time, the workers would basically be like worked almost like out to death to the point that they could no longer handle it. Women and children were mostly just gassed immediately because they couldn't work. Anyway, so this is the description of a survivor. He said it would go something like this. The people were told they were being marched into the bath, and they would not at first notice the gas coming from perforations in metal columns. Then they would feel the gas and crowd together away from the menacing columns and finally stampede together toward the huge metal door with its little window, where they piled up in one blue, clammy, blood-spattered pyramid, clawing and mauling at each other even in death. Then the exhauster electric pumps removed the gas, the great metal door slid open, and the men of the Jewish Sonderkommando entered to clean the bodies. They actually had a unit of Jews who were forced to clean the bodies, presumably told that they would survive, until, of course, they too were killed. They wore gas masks and gum boots, and they carried hoses, for their first task was to remove the blood and defecation before dragging the clawing dead apart with nooses and hooks. This was the prelude to the ghastly search for gold, the removal of gold teeth and hair, which were regarded by the Germans as strategic materials. Then the journey by lift or rail wagon to the furnaces, the mill that ground the bodies into ash, and the lorry that stranded the ashes into the river. It's interesting that they actually accounted for all this. The reason we know so much about it is they actually wrote it all down on paper. They accounted for things like the volume of gold teeth, hair, clothing, etc. that they removed from these people. The gold teeth was actually melted down into gold bars for the Reichsbank, and some of it was then laundered in Switzerland. They used hair for mattresses. They used the fat from the human bodies for soap. They also took the underwear and the clothes from all of the people they killed, and they recycled them and they processed them. There was more to it than that. Some people were actually experimented on. They conducted things like temperature experiments to see how much cold or heat the human body could withstand. They used Polish girls in particular to test out various types of products to see how the human body would react to certain injections, vaccines, and so on. In the end, they killed about 6 million people. You might have heard, have I disgusted you, or do you have somewhere to go? You have a midterm, all right. Now, I apologize for the graphic nature of the lecture, but I do think it's an important subject. As you know, there are people who deny that all of this happened, and the trouble is it's exceedingly well documented. It's true that the Nazis didn't just kill Jews. They also killed Slavs, many Russians, as I said, commissars, gypsies, the mentally ill, many Germans who just happened to be mentally ill or terminally ill, that is, people who would not be able to live without hope. They euthanized them, they basically killed them. There was a certain brutality to it, but also a clinical nature to it. Hannah Arendt used this phrase in the 1960s. She called it the banality of evil, how kind of boring and banal it was. She was referring to Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the most notorious, but by no means the most murderous of the commissars of these death camps. He was the one, incidentally, who, when the Israelis executed him after putting him on trial in the early 60s, the government of Saudi Arabia announced this with the headline that Adolf Eichmann, who had the honor of killing 6 million Jews, has been executed. It was in the headline of the official Saudi government newspaper. That is the most remarkable thing about it. Many of these Germans actually later confessed and described in detail what they had done. Now, not all of them, obviously. Many of them minimized it or tried to lie about it, but many of them were, in fact, quite open about it. They realized that it was this kind of almost infamous crime that, interestingly, they did not tell the German people about. Hitler didn't entirely trust the Germans. There was a phrase that they used that they would not, although they all knew about it themselves and they all talked about it, they did not trust the Germans to tell it. They kept very tight security around the death camps. It's one of those things I guess you can either believe or not believe. Did the Germans know about it or not? They knew that Jews were being rounded up and put onto trains. Maybe they didn't know exactly what was happening to them. But that said, we cannot blame only the Germans for this horrible episode in modern history. There were other volunteers. France actually rounded up the Vichy government, tens of thousands of Jews, many of them French citizens, and sent them to the death camps. Not as many as some other countries. The Italian record was a little better than the French. The record of the Danes was actually the best of all among countries that Hitler controlled, although the Danes didn't have that many Jews to begin with. They actually have a whole Fight for Freedom museum, they call it, about it. Some of the other countries, again, Spain actually had the best record, in part because Franco was independent. The countries in Eastern Europe had a much darker record, and in many of them, they devised their own methods of killing Jews, which were quite horrible, involving things like meat hooks, famously in Yugoslavia. A lot of this stuff still had a lingering after effects into the 1990s, not just involving Jews again. Of course, many Serbs suffered as well. And one of the reasons that the Serbs were so, shall we say, vengeful, seeking vengeance against both Muslims and Croats in the 1990s, is that as they saw it, both of them had been complicit in the death battalions. With some justice, there definitely were volunteers, both Croats and Muslims, who served in the Nazi death battalions. That said, the Germans bear the ultimate responsibility, even if they had a lot of help. In fact, one of the curious aspects about the kind of German war machine as it eventually is ground down by the Russians is that as the Germans, having expanded into the killing grounds of Eastern Europe, as they came back to Europe, many people actually came with them. Not just the million Soviets who volunteered to fight in the German army, but anyone who had even briefly collaborated with them knew that, of course, Stalin was going to settle accounts with them. Stalin even had a rule that if you were captured prisoner by the German, you were in principle to be shot. And so people started going back with the Germans. The SS and the Einsatzgruppen, with so many foreign volunteers, they ended up making their own last stand with the Germans in the Battle of Berlin in 1945. One of the reasons that battle was so savage was because all of these people knew that if they ever went back to their countries of origins, they would all be executed as Nazi collaborators. And so the sort of almost escalating cycle of atrocity just got worse and worse, to the point where the Battle of Berlin alone caused 600,000 deaths just in the fight for Berlin at the end of the war. Have any of you been to Berlin? Yeah, I'll talk about this more on Friday, but you can't see it as much now. But in the early 90s, you could still see the scars from the war because the Soviets, being cheap, didn't actually rebuild East Berlin. So you could literally see where the battles had taken place, the bullet holes where the snipers had been. I mean, all in all, it's a colossally important story. And in a way, it is the story of the Second World War. We in the West like to talk about things like D-Day and El Alamein and the Italian campaign, Battle of France, Battle of the Bulge. But the vast majority of the fighting and the killing was done on the Eastern Front. The Soviets in the end lost about 27 million men, although admittedly a lot of those were killed by Stalin. Still, they lost almost 30 million men. And the entire fighting strength of the German army, something like 70% of the casualties were suffered on the Eastern Front against the Red Army, which of course by 1944, 1945, despite the fact that Germans were still more efficient, that is, they killed more Russians per soldier than the Russians killed Germans, just an immense fighting force. Of well over 10 million men. By that point, the Soviets had like 10,000 tanks. More than that in guns. They had overwhelming air superiority, and as they came into Eastern Europe, of course, they imposed their own version of murderous totalitarianism to replace Hitler. Basically, this area right here is an area where if you were in the 20th century, you would not have wanted to live, particularly in the middle of the 20th century. There's a new book called Bloodlands, actually, which tells the whole terrible story. People victimized by really both totalitarian empires. Many of them victimized by Hitler and the Nazis, many of them victimized by Stalin and the communists, many of them victimized by both, even in the course of weeks where a town might change hands and atrocities and counter-atrocities are committed. It's a terrible story, but one you have to get to grips with if you're going to understand the 20th century. So that's it for today. Someone had a midterm, apparently. Briefly about our midterm, it is going to be next Wednesday, 5:30. I think I sent you all the room number, right? The email. I'll send it again. The 30th of March. Next Wednesday, 5:30 p.m. It's over in Iktisad. I forget the room number, but I think it's like 127 or something. Is that right? Although we are going to go into the early Cold War next Wednesday before the midterm will only go up to the Second World War. So at least for the midterm, you don't have to worry about the early Cold War. That is, it will cover what we do this week, but not what we do next Wednesday, if you understand.